Penelope Mogano and her husband Carlo Mogano had built what appeared to be an ordinary, respectable life. Both had grown up on the Isle of Wight. They met and married in the 1930s and eventually settled down in Coventry, where Carlo had found work at the Daimler Company car factory. They raised 2 sons together and were regarded by neighbours as a devoted, close-knit family. During World War II, bombing raids destroyed the family home in Coventry, which, like many families, the war years would separate their family for some time. This forced Penelope and the children to temporarily return to the Isle of Wight, while Carlo stayed behind for work. After the war, the family were reunited, and by the early 1950s they had moved to 7 Holland Road in Radford, a suburb of Coventry. To those around them, the Moganos seemed content. Carlo had progressed into a supervisory role at Daimler, while Penelope had dedicated herself to the home and the children. Their shared passion was old-time ballroom dancing, and within Coventry's dancing circles they were well-known faces at local events and gatherings. But everything changed on Monday the 18th of January 1954. Coventry was gripped by bitter winter weather that day. As usual, Carlo returned home for lunch. The couple's youngest son, Adrian, had also come home for lunch. Penelope prepared their meal and mentioned she planned to visit family friends, Sydney and Mrs. Worrell, for afternoon tea later that day. At around 1:45 p.m, Carlo left, returning to work, and Adrian left to go back to school. It was the last time either of them would ever see Penelope alive. So as far as anyone knows, Mrs. Mogano was home alone when someone apparently came to the house. That afternoon, Adrian was late home after his mother had asked him to collect some laundry on his way home from school. When he arrived home shortly before 5 p.m, he discovered both the front and the back doors locked. He knocked repeatedly, but there was no answer. Assuming his mother had stayed longer than expected with the Worrells, he waited outside in the cold. Nearly an hour later, Carlo returned home from work to find his son still sitting on the doorstep, and the two entered the house together. At first, nothing appeared unusual. Penelope kept a very clean and tidy house. The kitchen was spotless, as was the lounge, and the fireplace had been prepared ready for the evening. Carlo stepped into the dining room, and he froze. He found Penelope slumped in an easy chair, and she was drenched in blood. On her lap lay a carving knife, 12 inches long and covered in blood. Carlo immediately ushered Adrian from the house and called for the police. Detectives arriving at 7 Holland Road quickly established that there had been no burglary. Nothing appeared to be stolen. There was no signs of a struggle elsewhere in the house, and no evidence of forced entry. As forensic officers sealed off the property and began examining the scene, Penelope's body was taken for post-mortem examination. As was routine in domestic murder investigations, the husband, Carlo Mogano, became the first suspect. He was taken to the Coventry police headquarters and questioned for almost 10 hours. By the following morning, detectives were satisfied he had no involvement and released him without charge. Throughout the inquiry, Carlo appeared genuinely bewildered by the murder. He said, and to quote, "There were no secrets between my wife and myself, and she had no particular dance partner other than me. As far as I know, she hadn't an enemy in the world." End quote. The sheer brutality of the killing stunned Coventry. Fearing they might be dealing with an exceptionally dangerous killer, Chief Constable Edward Pendleton requested assistance from Scotland Yard. Detective Superintendent John Edmonds and Detective Sergeant Ted Williams travelled to Coventry to assist the local detectives. The post-mortem examination only deepened the horror of the crime. Pathologist Professor James Webster found that Penelope had suffered around 25 separate injuries. Defensive wounds on her hands and arms showed she had desperately fought to protect herself. Severe mutilation had been inflicted around her mouth, lips and tongue with a sharp weapon, but it was the blunt force injuries that had proved fatal. Professor Webster concluded that Penelope had been repeatedly struck with a heavy object, possibly a hammer, causing catastrophic fractures to the skull and massive brain damage. She died from shock and devastating head injuries inflicted during a sustained and frenzied assault. One important possibility was ruled out almost immediately. There was no evidence of SA. The timeline of the murder narrowed the investigation further. The post-mortem suggested, investigators believed, Penelope died sometime during the afternoon, likely before 4 p.m. She had never arrived at the Worrells' house for tea, which had been expected around 3 p.m, meaning detectives believed the killer had entered the house sometime shortly after Carlo and Adrian had left at around 1:45 p.m. Evidence inside the house appeared to support this theory. On the bed in the main bedroom lay a freshly laundered dress, yet Penelope was discovered still wearing her house clothes and her apron. Carlo later insisted his wife would never have visited friends dressed so casually and would rarely even answer the door unless she was dressed nicely. Detectives concluded she had probably been preparing to change when someone interrupted her. But who and how? There were no signs of forced entry, and the doors had been locked after the killer left. Investigators increasingly suspected that Penelope had willingly opened the door to her attacker, either because she recognised them or because they had posed as someone trustworthy. Police explored every aspect of Penelope's private life, searching for a motive. Friends and neighbours consistently described the Moganos as respectable, devoted and happily married. No evidence of affairs or family disputes emerged. Attention soon turned to the couple's involvement in Coventry's old-time ballroom dancing scene, particularly their association with Radford's Savoy Ballroom. Detectives interviewed every member connected to the club, believing the answer might lie within their social circle. During these inquiries, investigators uncovered an unusual detail. Only months before her death, Penelope had suddenly altered parts of her routine. Although the Moganos had previously fostered children and still had a foster child living with them, Penelope abruptly ended the arrangement and returned the child to a children's home. Around the same time as this, she resigned from the Radford Townswomen's Guild, explaining that the constant engagements had left her exhausted. Yet witnesses later claimed that they'd seen Penelope leaving home during afternoons, carrying dancing shoes wrapped in brown paper. How they knew they were dancing shoes in brown paper, I don't know. Carlo claimed to know nothing about these outings. Neither did her closest friends. Detectives looked into whether Penelope had been secretly taking dance lessons or meeting someone involved in the ballroom scene. Despite public appeals, no one came forward to say they had been teaching her privately or meeting her for any reason for that matter. It was a mystery. If they were involved, they probably wouldn't admit it, would they? The mystery of where she had been going would remain unsolved. Meanwhile, police launched an enormous search for the murder weapon, believed to have been a round-head hammer, weighing around 2 pounds. Gardens, drains, open land and ponds throughout Radford were searched in painstaking detail. The weapon was never found. Several fingerprints recovered from the crime scene also failed to match any known offender. As the investigation widened, detectives interviewed tradesmen, delivery drivers, neighbours and violent offenders across Coventry. Mental hospitals were even contacted to determine whether any patient had escaped on the day of the murder. Nothing produced a breakthrough. In an unusually extensive move for the time, police distributed questionnaires to more than 1,500 homes across Radford, asking residents about suspicious behaviour, unusual visitors and movements on the afternoon Penelope was killed. The investigation revealed two strange characters. The first was a man posing as an electrical inspector who had reportedly visited homes occupied by women alone throughout the district, claiming to be investigating electrical problems. He persuaded several women to let him inside before allegedly making inappropriate advances. Witnesses described him as a man in his mid to late 20s with thick, dark, wavy hair, a rosy complexion, and a distinctive, pleasant, musical laugh. He reportedly spoke with a London accent and wore a dark overcoat over a red plaid shirt. Most disturbingly, one sighting placed a man matching his description only around 180 yards from Holland Road at approximately 1:30 p.m. on the day of the murder. The second mystery man was seen near a telephone kiosk in Heathcote Street around 3:30 p.m. A witness observed him leaving the kiosk with a makeshift bandage wrapped around his right hand. The cloth appeared heavily blood-stained. The man lingered nearby for several minutes before running off towards Kersley. Bloodstains were later discovered inside the kiosk. Neither man was ever identified, and there were no reports of any strange noises or occurrences in the area at the time of the murder. And by the end of February 1954, the investigation had effectively ground to a halt. Police had taken around 25,000 statements, eliminated countless suspects, and pursued every credible lead they could find, yet they still had no murder weapon, no clear motive, and no suspect strong enough to charge. Over time, the case became one of Coventry's most haunting unsolved murders. Obviously, DNA analysis didn't exist in 1954. Detectives relied mostly entirely on witness accounts, interviews, and painstaking door-to-door police work. Even now, the case continues to raise unsettling questions. The violence used suggested to some investigators a deeply personal attack, yet it also showed signs of planning and control. There was no forced entry. Investigators suspected the killer may have brought the weapon to the house and removed it afterwards. They escaped without drawing attention, despite the amount of bloodshed inside the dining room. Some investigators later believed the killer may have been someone familiar with Radford, someone comfortable moving through the area and not be seen. The motive, however, has never been explained. Police had quickly ruled out robbery. Nothing was taken, and the violence appeared fueled by rage rather than theft. Yet detectives uncovered no evidence that anyone had openly hated Penelope. Still, two strange incidents left investigators wondering whether the Moganos had somehow attracted an enemy connected to Coventry's dancing circles. Just 3 nights before Penelope's murder, the home of Sidney Worrell, a well-known figure within the local ballroom community and one of the friends of the Moganos, was targeted in what appeared to be an arson attack. Petrol had been poured through an open pantry window before the fire was started. Fortunately, the blaze was extinguished before serious damage occurred. Months earlier, the Mogano's own car had also been targeted. Petrol-soaked rags were placed beneath the bonnet in an apparent attempt to set it alight. Whether the incidents were acts of vandalism or signs of something more sinister has never been established. More than 70 years later, the murder of Penelope Mogano remains unsolved, and the identity of the person or persons responsible that entered 7 Holland Road that freezing January afternoon has never been discovered. Anne Noblett. The murder of 17-year-old Anne Noblett remains one of Britain's most haunting unsolved cases. A crime so strange and disturbing that even decades later, investigators still struggle to explain exactly what happened during the final hours of her life. Newspapers would eventually nickname it the Deep Freeze Murder, a title that sounded more like fiction than reality. But behind the headlines was a real young woman whose disappearance devastated her family. In the winter of 1957, Marshall's Heath was still a quiet rural area on the edge of Hertfordshire countryside. Neighbours knew one another. Doors were often left unlocked. Violent crime felt distant, something that happened in big cities, not in villages, surrounded by winding lanes and dark woodland. Anne Noblett had grown up in that world. She lived with her brothers and parents, Thomas and Ira Noblett, in a comfortable family home. By all accounts, Anne had enjoyed a stable upbringing. Friends described her as intelligent, polite and dependable. She attended Watford Technical College and was said to have no known enemies, no troubled relationships, and no reason to disappear voluntarily. But on Monday the 30th of December 1957, a day that began as an entirely ordinary day, something changed. The Christmas holidays were coming to an end, and that evening Anne travelled to Harpenden to attend a dance at Lord's Hall with friends. The hall was popular with local young people. Nothing about Anne's behaviour that night appeared unusual. At the end of the evening she said goodbye to her friends, reportedly telling them she would see them again on Friday. Shortly before 6 o'clock, Anne boarded the 391 Green Line bus for the journey home. The route wound through the dark Hertfordshire roads towards Marshall Heath. Winter had already settled over the countryside. The lanes were poorly lit, and beyond the occasional passing car, there was little movement after dark. A friend, Shirley Edwards, later confirmed seeing Anne step off the bus near the Cherry Trees pub at the bottom of Marshall Heath Lane at around 6 p.m. From there, Anne faced only a short walk home. But she never arrived. At first her disappearance made little sense. Anne was not known to stay out unexpectedly, and as the hours passed her family became increasingly alarmed. Eventually police were contacted and officers began searching the surrounding area. Search teams combed fields, roadside ditches, hedgerows and nearby woodland. Police dogs were brought in. Volunteers joined the effort, but there was no sign of Anne. No discarded belongings, no witnesses to an attack, no clear indication of where she had gone after leaving the bus. It was later reported the red rear lights of a car farther along Marshall Heath Lane had possibly been seen around the approximate time Anne had vanished. But investigators could never conclusively connect the vehicle to the case. But this detail lingered uneasily in the background of the inquiry. Had Anne accepted a lift from somebody she knew, or had someone been waiting for her? As days turned into weeks, anxiety spread through the local community. Then 1 month later came the discovery that transformed the case from a missing person inquiry into one of the most baffling murder investigations in British criminal history. On the 31st of January 1958, brothers Hugh and Brian Simmons were walking their dog Rip through Rose Grove Woods, known locally as Youngswood, near Whitwell, several miles from where Anne had disappeared. The woodland was quiet and isolated, the kind of place few people visited during the winter. As the dog moved ahead through the undergrowth, the brothers noticed something lying in a clearing. At first glance, it looked almost as though somebody was asleep, but as they moved closer, the horrifying reality became clear. It was Anne Noblett. Her body was lying among dense scrub, roughly 300 yards from the nearest road. She was fully clothed, and remarkably, her spectacles were still resting on her face. Nearby were some of her personal belongings. But what shocked investigators most was the condition of the body itself. The discovery immediately confused the police. The weather throughout much of January had been relatively mild, but Anne's body was described as extremely cold and showing signs consistent with refrigeration. Although they had been cold spells, investigators, after consulting with experts, believed the relatively mild weather made natural freezing of a body outdoors Possible but unlikely, but it was never scientifically proven beyond doubt. Experienced detectives quickly realized something was deeply wrong. The investigation was led by Detective Chief Superintendent Robert Elwell, assisted by Detective Superintendent Richard Lewis from New Scotland Yard. As forensic examinations began, the mystery only deepened. Home Office pathologist Francis Camps carried out the post-mortem examination. He concluded Anne had died from strangulation, and evidence suggested SA may have taken place shortly before her death. There were further disturbing details. Although Anne's body had been found clothed, evidence suggested she had been undressed and then redressed after death. Buttons on her undergarments had been fastened incorrectly, strongly implying another person had dressed the body. The contents of Anne's stomach also indicated she had died not long after leaving the bus. Food eaten earlier that day had barely begun digesting. Investigators now believed Anne had been abducted, murdered soon afterwards, and then hidden somewhere else for weeks before her body was finally dumped in the woodland. But where and by whom? Dr. Camps reached a chilling conclusion. Anne's body had most likely been stored in some kind of refrigeration unit. The press seized upon the revelation immediately. Headlines across Britain branded the case the deep freeze murder, a phrase that captured both the bizarre forensic evidence and the public imagination. And in 1958, industrial refrigeration units were very uncommon outside of farms, factories, butchers, food storage businesses and specialised workshops. Domestic freezers were still rare luxuries in British homes. Detectives believed this detail could help narrow down their search for the killer. Police launched an enormous search operation across Hertfordshire and neighbouring counties. Refrigerated storage facilities within roughly a 30-mile radius were investigated. Officers searched barns, garages, warehouses, farms and factory buildings. Anyone with access to industrial cooling equipment drew police attention. But despite hundreds of interviews and extensive inquiries, nothing definitive emerged. Another detail troubled investigators deeply. Anne weighed around 11 stone, and because the body had been frozen, carrying it into the woods would have been physically demanding. Yet police found no drag marks at the scene. This suggested organisation, strength and planning. Police believed the body had likely been transported deliberately under the cover of darkness, choosing an isolated woodland spot where discovery might be delayed. Experts examining the vegetation beneath Anne's remains made another important observation. The plant undergrowth beneath the body differed from the surrounding areas, leading police to believe the body had only been placed there perhaps 1 or 2 weeks before it was found, despite Anne having disappeared over a month earlier. For weeks then, her killer may have kept her hidden somewhere unknown. The idea horrified the public. Fear spread rapidly across Hertfordshire. Parents warned daughters not to travel alone. And yet detectives struggled to establish a motive beyond the SA. Anne had no known boyfriend, no criminal connections, and no obvious enemies. At the inquest, her father described her as a girl with no cares or worries whatsoever. The case seemed motiveless, random, and terrifyingly senseless. As public fascination intensified, hoaxers and attention seekers began targeting those connected to the investigation. In the weeks after Anne's body was discovered, Anne's mother received disturbing anonymous telephone calls. So too did Hugh Simmons, one of the men who found Anne's body. Eventually, police traced the calls to a 25-year-old Luton man named Walter Edward Nunn. He was sentenced to 6 months in prison for making the malicious calls, but investigators never connected him to Anne's murder. Police investigating the murder of 19-year-old Mary Creek a Dutch girl working in the UK, who was found brutally murdered at Boxted, Essex, on January the 6th, 1958, joined forces for a time with the Scotland Yard, Hertfordshire investigation into the murder of Anne. The similarities in the two cases were that each girl was seen getting off the bus alone in a countryside location. Investigators searched deeper for more potential links. In 1959, police arrested two suspects at Southend who fit profile of interest and questioned them about both the murders. One of them turned out to be a refrigeration expert. Despite intense questioning surrounding both cases, police could not find enough evidence to build a case, and both suspects were ultimately released without charge. Years passed, witness memories faded, potential suspects died, physical evidence deteriorated, and what once had been one of Britain's largest murder inquiries slowly became a cold case. But it was never forgotten. Over the decades, Hertfordshire's police reopened and reviewed the evidence several times, including a major review in 2017. Detectives acknowledged, however, that modern forensic opportunities were limited because little usable evidence had survived from the original investigation. Today, the identity of Anne Noblett's killer remains unknown. Somewhere in the final hours of the 30th of December 1957, a teenager walking home along a quiet Hertfordshire lane encountered somebody capable of calculated violence. Years later, the deep freeze murder still stands as one of Britain's most eerie and unsettling unsolved crimes. Thank you for watching, or even just listening.